He knocked on the door like someone running out of time. The rain was a hard, impatient thing that night, slanting off the eaves in sheets, rattling the iron gate, pushing itself through every seam of the estate. A single lamp burned over the porch, haloing the polished wood. Eli's knuckles were raw from the repeated taps, and his breath fogged in front of him with each impatient sob. He had rehearsed what he'd say all the way down the lane, in the dark of the bus, between the shouted insults and the slam of the bedroom door. Now the words came raw and small. "Please." He swallowed. His voice curdled into the rain. "Can I stay one night? I'll leave in the morning." For a long second, the door did not open. The house itself seemed to listen. An enormous thing of stone and shutters, shut against the world, with a whisper history in its walls. Rumors clung to the place like ivy. A man who never gave interviews, a man whose name came with lowered eyes and quick, nervous fingers in the town. Some people called him a boss. Others called him a shadow. Eli had heard the names in the same breath as threats, as power, as enough money to buy silence. He had also heard the rumor that the man kept a kettle boiling all night. When the latch clicked, the door opened an inch. A face looked down at him, not young, not kind in the conventional way, but not unhuman. The eyes were the color of old whiskey. They measured Eli without spectacle. Rain beaded on the man's coat. He smelled faintly of tobacco and lemon oil. When he spoke, his voice came even and small, as if words were tools, and he wanted only the right one. "Come in," he said. Inside, the entryway smelled of coffee and citrus cleaner. Towels were folded on a chair. A lamp glowed beside a low stack of books. The man did not ask for papers. He did not demand that Eli explain every detail. He set a towel in Eli's hands like an offering and stepped back to let him inside. Eli stood there, dripping and doubled over, shaking not only from the rain. He had a small backpack, the kind cut too small for the distance he'd come, containing a sketchbook whose corner had been torn, a box of charcoal smudged with his fingerprints, the last of his clothes folded tight. When the man took the towel from him, he did it without touching the boy more than necessary. It was a careful, non-circling kindness. "This is dangerous," Eli said, because danger was the air he'd been breathing for weeks. "People. My dad." "Not tonight," the man interrupted softly. He set a mug down on the nearest surface. Lukewarm tea, spiced with something sweet. "You smell like wet wool. Sit." There was soup, plain, thick, the kind that swallowed the cold. A spare room had a blanket, a lamp, a bedside table with a dog-eared copy of an old poetry book. The mattress was not luxurious, but it did not creak under the weight of panic. The man showed Eli where the bathroom was. He left a bag of dry clothes down the hall with a note. "Change when you're ready." Eli lay in the bed that first night with the towel folded under his cheek like some small talisman. The house hummed, a low, steady machine voice, and sometimes the clack of shutters. He slept in fits and starts, waking to the sense of an intruder, a distant shouting he had conjured from his own past. Each time he opened his eyes and saw the lamp, the curtain's edge, the shadow on the ceiling, he told himself a small, trembling truth. He had asked for one night. He had said the words. The man had answered. Outside, rain went on like a metronome. Inside, small things kept the night steady. The kettle boiled and hissed at odd hours. A clock ticked somewhere in the hall, and the faint sound of a radio tuned to classical music threaded through the rooms, low and comforting. In the morning, the light came silver and patient through drawn curtains. The man had been awake before him. A mug steamed on the small table, and a towel lay folded on the dresser, fresh and sweet with lemon. He learned, almost immediately, that the man had habits that looked nothing like the rumors. He fed the dogs, 2 old hounds with halting, polite tails, by the back door with a slow, precise hand. He tended to a tiny garden behind the house. Not the sprawling lawns the public imagined, but rows of herbs and lettuce, like a patchwork of private green. He did not ask about Eli's past unless Eli offered it. He did not make light of the boy's trembling. He offered a kind of steadiness you could set your cup upon and not fear it would tip. Days fell into a pattern that felt like healing because it was insistently mundane. There were mornings with coffee whose steam clouded the air, and the man, who occasionally answered to no name at all, moving slowly around the kitchen, humming a note Eli could not place. Afternoons when Eli swept the small courtyard until his shoulders ached, and evenings when the man would sit in the den and read aloud passages from books whose spines were soft with use. Sometimes the man handed Eli a towel and taught him how to scrub the floor with small, circular motions until the dust gleamed like something confessed. At other times, he handed him a hammer and guided his hands steady as they mended a gate. The physical work did not cure anything instantly. It only made the body trust itself again. There were nights when Eli's hands went to his sketchbook the way a child reaches for a blanket. He drew the way someone maps a route back to themselves. Eyes, hands, the rough clay of a fist around a coffee cup. The pages filled with faces and leaves, and, occasionally, the dim silhouette of the man in the doorway, a presence sketched in quick charcoal lines that softened when Eli looked again. He kept that book beneath his pillow like contraband. The man, reserved, sharp, with the habit of survival, had a way of telling stories in fragments. A woman he had once loved who liked to wear red. A voice with a laugh that hadn't been heard in a long time. Plans that had been made and then folded like napkins. Once, in a fit of careless honesty, he admitted to crying once when a bird flew into his conservatory and could not find its way out. "I don't like to watch things get hurt when I can stop it," he said. Even small things. Eli listened because to listen was a way to remember how people could sound when they were not shouting. He shared nothing of his past at first, because words felt like paper boats. There were moments when he would let out a piece, "Dad said I had to leave," and the man would simply nod, as if that completed the sentence. No lecture, no moral weight. Just a mug set down with the cautious clink that meant someone had anchored themselves in the same room as you. The town crept back into his life with the caution of someone reintroducing a feral animal to its range. On the third afternoon, the man placed a hand on the old coat he had given Eli and said, "You'll need to run an errand today. Just one. The woman at the market. She knows my face but not my name. She'll sell you bread." It was a small test and also a gift. The walk to the market was 10 minutes through the rain-softened streets. People glanced at him, but no one touched him. The grocer packed a bruised apple in with the bread and smiled like it was no effort. There were folk who recognized the estate's name and crossed the street. There were others who pretended not to. At the stall, an older woman, hands like work-worn maps, looked at his soaked coat and asked, "You all right, love?" "Yes," Eli said, surprising himself by replying easily. He'd wanted to say more. "No, I'm not. I'm 17 and I have nowhere else to go." But those words tasted too much like pleading. Instead, he accepted the apple and the small warmth of acknowledgement. When he returned, the man did not ask whether anyone had spoken. He simply handed Eli a towel and asked him how the bread was. There were nights Eli thought he would run. Panic arrived like a sound that rose from his rib cage. Quick, hot, and not always in rhythm with the weather. He would wake, hands clenching the blanket, and the house would be empty except for the low hum of the fridge. Winter sense, alert and absolute, made him feel lightheaded. The past, in these hours, came back in the shape of thrown plates and slammed doors, and the soft, deadly geometry of silence in his father's face when he'd said, "There is no room here for this." Each time he almost bolted, the house delivered a small, steadying ritual. A bowl of stew left at the door. The man's shadow moving through the hall, leaving a chair near the bed. A hand instead of a sermon, a towel instead of a judgment. Once, when Eli's breathing would not slow, the man brought him a cup of warm milk and sat in the doorway like a human fence between panic and the night. He didn't speak much. He only hummed a low, wordless thing as if the sound could keep the dark from sharpening its teeth. It was during those first uneasy nights that Eli began to talk in shards. No diminishing the pain, no encyclopedic cataloging of hurts. Just the obvious pieces, enough to make a map. "They found my sketchbook," he told the man once, chin tucked against the collar of his jacket, eyes on the floor. "Dad tore it, said it was proof." "Proof of what?" the man asked. "That I'm not what he wanted," Eli said. The sentence folded in on itself and then lay still. "That's a small, cruel thing to say," the man observed, as if he were describing weather. He reached into a pocket and pulled out a pen, handing it to Eli. "You can draw here. It won't get torn." There was no gush of heroism in that moment. No sharp music and no triumphant arrest of fate. It was a small kindness. The pen was used to trace a face in charcoal, then a hand, and then, slowly, the line of a city street that might be someplace else. Those drawings were the first things the man did not touch. He left them where Eli wanted them. No comment, no inspection. Not all the days were gentle. The town did not forget that the estate belonged to someone whose name carried weight. Once, while Eli was at the market, a neighbor, a woman who tended a flower shop and knew everything about people's marriages, stopped by the house to deliver a package and peered into the courtyard, then to the windows. Her eyes flickered over the curtains, and briefly she raised a brow. When she left, she had not knocked. She had, instead, folded her hands and walked away as if folding a thing back into its pocket. Rumors traveled quicker than kindness. Rumors made Eli flinch in ways he could not always control. He had spent too many nights under roofs that had become traps for the unwary. He had learned the old lesson: when people whisper, your life is an exhibit. He had also learned that the man was not the kind of person to make a spectacle of what he guarded. Once, after a neighbor's curious glance, Eli woke from a bad dream gasping, and found the man sitting at the foot of the bed like a sentinel. "You heard something?" the man asked, voice low as a bell. "People talking," Eli said. The admission was a small exposure. "About you. About me." The man considered, then answered, "Let them talk. We keep to our rooms." That night the man took down a few lamps and left the house darker than before, as if by choice. It made the world shrink in a way that made the boy breathe easier. He traced the contour of the man's hand as the older man set the kettle to boil. There was a small scar across the knuckle. Nothing romantic, nothing mythic, just a line that said he'd been careless with steel once. It steadied Eli to know the man bore marks of living too. There was a phone call that broke the rhythm. Not a dramatic thing at first, only a small freezing ring in the night. Eli had kept his phone turned off for 2 days, as if silence were a refuge. When it finally buzzed, the screen lit with a name he had practiced ignoring: Micah, his brother. He stared for a long time. In the dim hall, the man watched him without asking to see the caller ID. "You can take it outside," he offered. "If you don't want—" Eli left the room and stood in the doorway, rain making the porch planks dark. He pressed the phone to his ear with hands that were suddenly clumsy. Micah's voice was thin, the kind of voice that tries to sound happy and ends up sounding like it's breaking glass. "Eli? Hey, where are you?" "At a friend's," Eli said. It was a small and dishonest thing to say. The rain worked at the words and made them smaller. Silence on the line. Then a rush. "Wait, Eli, he's been calling everyone. Where are you? Are you okay? Why didn't you tell me? I tried to—" "I couldn't," Eli said. The single syllable felt like a confession and a shield. "I had to go." "Go where? Who's with you?" "I don't want—" Eli's throat closed. He could hear his brother breathless on the other end, trying to wrap himself around a shadow larger than his capacity. "I don't want to be talked about." Micah made a noise like a laugh that was not happy. "Talked about? Eli, we can get you back. He's not—" Eli began, and then stopped. He did not want to put the man in the position of explaining the unmystified kindness. He did not want to make his salvation into a spectacle for his brother. "I'm okay. I'm somewhere safe." There was a clatter of someone trying to sound calm, and failing. "You left? Did you take anything? Your sketchbook? Did they—" "No," Eli said sharply, the word meant to end that line. "Micah, I can't do this on a loop, please." "What do you mean?" There was a smaller, more human panic now, edged with guilt. "Eli, we can come get you. Please. Just—" A pause. "Where are you?" Eli glanced over his shoulder. The shadow at the end of the hall was motionless, a discreet presence. He felt a stupid kind of protectiveness rise for the man who had given him a towel. The man had backed up to the window, hands in his pockets, looking outward as if checking the perimeter of his life for threats. "I'm staying with someone," Eli lied again, and this time the lie felt like a map folded to hide a path. "Please don't. Don't make a scene. I'm trying. Micah's voice turned small. You could have told me. I couldn't. I had to leave. The sentence floated between them like a thin thread. I needed one night. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Micah said, Call me tomorrow. I'll come find you. Don't disappear. I won't, Eli promised, because promises to brothers had the right weight. He was not sure he could keep it. He ended the call with his thumb sliding across the screen, a movement that felt like shifting an image. Afterwards, he returned to the kitchen where the man had been standing by the window. The older man's face did not change at the sight of the phone. He poured 2 cups of coffee, black as night, and handed Eli one without a word, as if to say nothing had been disturbed. Did he sound? Eli began, the sentence abandoned like a stone. Frayed, the man supplied. Brothers often are, not the same as malice. Eli took a careful sip. Temperature told him the world was still intact. He said he would come. Then he'll come. The statement had the calm definitiveness of someone comfortable with the idea of arrival and departure. If you want him to. I don't know, Eli admitted. The confession was more of a beam being lowered. I promised him I wouldn't disappear, but I promised you I'd leave in the morning. The man regarded him for a long time. There was something like a calculation behind his eyes, but not the cold math Eli had expected from a rumor. It was as if the man was weighing the shape of a life rather than a ledger. You will make the decision you need to make, he said at last. Not the decision anyone else wants for you. That is how you keep your life. Eli had not thought of the choice in that raw way. Choice had been a sequence of reactions before. A slammed door, a packed bag, a flight. The notion that he could sit with the possibility and choose deliberately felt like a new muscle. Do you regret it? He asked, surprise in his voice. Helping me? Taking me in? The man looked at him and something like a thin smile touched the corner of his mouth. Regret only finds me when I am trying to keep score of kindness I've given, he said. I don't keep that sort of ledger. There was an honesty to it that did not ask for thanks. Eli felt for the first time in weeks that he owed nothing to the world but his own next step. The house offered small, quiet sanctuaries for his bruised self. The man left out a spare toothbrush and showed him a drawer with bandages and a pair of socks, thick as hearth moss. He taught Eli how to tie the laces on a boot properly, watching his fingers for the hesitation that panic leaves behind. He instructed him on the care of the dogs, how to scratch behind an ear without startling them, where to place their waters so they wouldn't track mud. He introduced Eli to the rhythm of washing dishes, so that the clatter of plates became a kind of measured percussion that calibrated breathing. One afternoon, as the sun slanted low and mild like a private forgiveness, an envelope appeared on the table addressed to Eli. It came with the Morning Post, folded neat as if the world still expected him to exist in 2 places at once. He opened it with hands that trembled. School paperwork. A notice of enrollment and deadlines. A letter from a teacher he had admired months ago, asking whether Eli needed to continue classes. He sat on the stoop and held the paper like a map. The town hummed in the distance. Somewhere, a child laughed. The envelope felt like a hand extended. Nothing more, nothing less. And the proper answer, the one that did not have to be shouted over slamming doors, surfaced like tide. He wanted to go back, to reclaim the line of himself that had been erased in a furious parental sentence. He wanted to go to art class and learn to draw hands that didn't shake with fear. He wanted to show his brother that he could be present and not disappear. But the thought also filled him with an enormous vertigo. Going back meant calls and confrontations and perhaps a conversation with the man whose home had become his shelter, one that might explain the unexplainable. Going back meant the possibility of doors shutting again. Going back meant he would have to be brave in a public place, not just behind the sanctuary's shutters. He kept the envelope beneath his pillow for several nights, unfolding it and smoothing it like a ritual, as if proof could be softened by repetition. Sometimes he would draw in the margins, hands and gaits and the curve of an eyebrow, as if he could sketch himself into the world. Days were not linear healers. They were patient and sometimes thin. There were nights when he dreamed of being boxed in again, when a voice that might have been his father's called out a condemnation he did not belong to. There were afternoons when he found himself laughing at a small joke and being startled by the sound because it was foreign to him. The man, who still answered to no name, began to leave little things by Eli's plate. A small lemon tart one evening, the leather of a wallet polished smooth another. These tokens were not gifts in the sense of payment. They were reminders that the world could be mundane and good. Once he took Eli to the conservatory and showed him an old gramophone. "It plays slow things well," he said, and set a record spinning. The music was scratchy but soft, and Eli found himself leaning into the sound as if it would teach him how to breathe. There was a tiny ritual that came to be the proof of the man's presence. In the mornings he would go out back and tend the small garden. He worked with gloves and a careful patience, pruning leaves, listening to the soil like someone listening for a confession. When Eli watched him, he saw the man as something more than the sum of neighborhood whispers. He was a man who understood maintenance, not of machines or money, but of small living things. Trust in this house was built like the garden. First one seed, then the next. A misplaced chair fixed, a mirror cleaned. Eli began to understand that the adult had given him more than a bed. He'd given him the time and space to learn to expect someone to stay. The man still had holdovers of his life that were opaque. He would sometimes disappear for hours, and when he returned, he would fold himself into the living room, as if wrapping a bandage around a hurt. He kept a single photograph in the den, just a fragment of a face at a wedding or a party, folded back so you could only see the edge of a mouth. Once, when Eli dared to look, the man made a small, incredulous sound and closed the album with a hand that was gentle and final. "Ask if you want," Eli ventured. "It's a book of things that were," the man said. "Sometimes the past is a weight, and sometimes it's a map. Depends on how you read it." One afternoon the man took Eli into town under the pretext of renewing a library card. Walking beside him, Eli felt the funny, dangerous notion that he belonged beside this man. Not like a secret prize, but like an ordinary person in company with another ordinary person. Their pace was measured. The man kept no arm around him. He kept his distance in a way that did not feel distant, but respectful of the lines that had recently been eroded. At the library, Eli filled out forms with a hand that was steadier than he would have imagined. The girl at the counter stamped his card with a small smile. The simple rhythm of bureaucracy, the stamping of paper, the exchange of signatures, was absurdly another kind of shelter. It meant that he was making a record in the world that did not require justification. As the weeks folded into some version of normal, Eli found himself practicing his art again. The sketchbook, rescued from the violence of the past, grew fat with drawings, eyes that watched without accusation, hands that reached for cups instead of slamming doors, the occasional study of the man's profile. He drew the dogs, thick with patience, the curve of the garden's rosemary, the way light fell across the man's jaw at dusk. Each line was a reclamation. Yet there were moments when the old reflexes kicked in, when a raised voice in the street made him flinch, or when a horn honked and it assembled a memory like a ruined house. These moments weren't signs of failure. They were the medicine of time, necessary irritants to encourage healing. He began to think, impossibly, about a future small and plausible, a class to take, a place to enroll, a schedule to fill. The thought terrified him and delighted him in equal measure. He wrestled with the question of how much to involve Micah. His brother's voice, when they spoke, was an arrow aimed at tenderness, clumsy but real. It would have been easy to call and say nothing, to keep this tiny sanctuary private. But the weight of family hung somewhere at his back, a thread he could not sever without consequence. One evening the man sat across from Eli by the kitchen table with 2 mugs between them and a map that was not a map at all, a ledger of things, of names of schools and addresses and small notes scrawled in the margin. He had been the one to gather the paper into a neat pile and to place it in front of Eli like an offering of options. "If you want to go back," he said, "I can sign a letter confirming you've been here. It won't be legal guardianship. It will be a thing that says you've had a place to sleep. It will not be anything farther." Eli stared at the paper, as if the ink might rearrange itself. Would you do that?" He watched the man's face flex in a way that was almost a smile. "I would," he said. "If it helps." Eli wanted to ask the question he'd been circling for days. Was the man doing this out of duty, or out of something softer? But words of that kind felt like they demanded a reciprocation he was not ready to give. Instead, he nodded. A small, decisive motion. "Thank you," he said. The words felt like something he had been taught in a classroom for the first time. An honest, public claim. "Don't thank me like I saved you," the man cautioned. "You did the hard work. You asked to stay. You had the courage to make that small claim." Eli half laughed, the sound sharp from disuse. "One night," he said. "That's all I asked for." "One night can make strange things possible," the man replied. "Or it can be a night. You will tell me which." It was not a grand pronouncement. It was a measure of responsibility given back to him like a glove. Eli thought of the envelope with the school form, the mud of the town street, the smell of soup and lemon towels. He could stay. He could go. The choice was both terrifying and simple. That week, a letter arrived with a return address of the school he had once loved. It contained a notice of a scholarship, an obscure small award for students who demonstrated perseverance in the arts. Eli nearly dropped the page when he saw the number. The figure was not enough to be life-altering, but it was enough to be a foothold. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the number before him, like a promise in figure form. The man stood at the window, watching the light move across the lawn as if it were something else to be tended. "This could mean classes," Eli said, the sentence a rumor in his own mouth. It could. The man did not rush to enthusiasm. He placed his hands on the table, those work-worn hands, and leaned in as if proximity alone might help the boy make the decision. Or it could be nothing. The chance is there. You must decide if you want to take it. Eli felt something in his chest harden into shape. He wanted to take it. The desire was bright and terrifying, like stepping onto a bridge without looking at the drop. It was the first time in a long while that his choices were aligned with what he wanted, rather than what he feared. That night, when the house had settled into its habitual calm, Eli went to his room and pulled out his sketchbook. He sketched a simple scene, a pair of hands tying the laces of a boot. One of the hands was mine, the other was someone else's. It was not a romantic picture. There was no tender touching, no interlaced fingers, just two hands working together. He shaded softly and closed the book with a quiet breath. Then his phone buzzed again. It was Micah. Eli's thumb hovered. He thought of the man who had given him a spare towel and a bed and refused to keep score of kindness. He thought of the letter with the scholarship number and the school forms waiting like keys in a drawer. He thought of a brother who loved in ways that were scrambled and tender. He thought of the life that had been ripped open the morning his father told him he wasn't wanted. He pressed accept. Micah's voice came through a little rushed, a little scared. "Are you there? Where are you? Please say you're okay." "I'm at a friend's," Eli said, an old reflex smoothing himself. Then, because he couldn't hold the lie like he could hold a pencil, he added, "I'm actually at a house. It's safe." Micah exhaled loud enough to hear. "Soon, I'm coming. Micah," Eli interrupted softly. "Don't make it a scene." Silence, then a softer, wounded laugh. "Of course not," his brother said. "I just want you safe." "Me too," Eli whispered. The man leaned against the doorway and watched the exchange as if cataloging its tone. When Eli hung up, the man said nothing. He only placed a hand on the back of a chair, as if steadying himself for a trajectory he was not obligated to take. "You called him," the man observed. "I did." The truth was bright and small, like the end of a pencil. "I told him not to make a scene. He said he'd come anyway." "Then he'll come." The certainty in his voice was not facile. The man seemed to know how arrival and departure rearranged people. "And you'll tell him what you need." "What if he doesn't understand?" Eli asked. "Then you'll keep telling him," the man answered. "Until he does." Eli lay awake that night with the sheet pulled up to his chin, and the envelope with the scholarship number tucked beneath his pillow. The thought of Micah coming felt like a bell in the distance. He did not know if he'd be brave enough to tell his brother the truth, to ask for the scant help he needed, to potentially reopen the door his father had slammed. He didn't know if he wanted to go back, or if he wanted to stay in the interim, anchored to the man who had handed him a towel without bargaining for his soul. In the low light of the room, he pressed his palm to the back of his neck, and felt, for the first time in months, a small unbroken thing. The future was not a demand, but an option. He could draw himself into it. He drifted then into a dream that folded together the smells of lemon and boiled soup and rain and the soft, steady presence of a man whose past was a closed book and whose hands were kind. In the dream, he tied the laces on boots that led him down a street neither dangerous nor safe, only alive. He woke to the kettle's soft sigh and the smell of coffee. At breakfast, the man pushed a small plate across the table with a pastry exactly the size of a blameless hope. He watched Eli take it and offered no comment, only a steady wrist that told the boy there were no strings. "You're thinking of something bigger," the man noted, as if reading the pattern on a rug. "You don't have to decide today." "I know," Eli said, "but I have to choose something soon." "Then choose what you need," the man advised, "not what others would like for you." Eli chewed in silence. The house hummed. Outside, the rain had softened into a polite mist. Somewhere beyond the hedges, town life resumed its manageable noise. When the front gate clanked open in the afternoon, Eli was on the porch watching the world like someone peering out of a cave. His heart did an odd flinch and then settled when he saw Micah step up with a backpack slung over one shoulder. His face rounded with exhaustion and worry, and the pale accuracy of a brother who had been trying not to panic. Eli stood, the air between them suddenly full of all the things that lay unsaid. Micah's eyes flicked toward the man behind him in the doorway, this quiet, steady figure, and then back to Eli with a mixture of gratitude and a thin, practical fear that said, "Now, how do we fix this?" The man nodded once, not in introduction and not in farewell, just as if to say he acknowledged the arrival of another character in the story. He did not step forward. He did not make speeches. For all his reputation, his public distance was a gift in a moment when the family needed to say what it had to say. "Hey," Micah began, the word cramped with relief. "You okay?" Eli blinked, the word heavy with the truth. He wanted to tell his brother everything and then nothing at all. He wanted to stay and let the shelter be his new home, and he wanted to leave and measure himself in the narrow light of classrooms and deadlines and the possibility of grown-up kindness. He took a breath as if he were about to draw a line on a page and decide which side of it to stand on. Then, because there are shapes of courage that are not loud but precise, he said, "Can we talk somewhere private?" Micah looked at the man, then at the gate, then back at him. "Yeah," he said slowly. "We can do that." The man inclined his head like a small benediction and closed the door quietly behind them. The gate shut with a click. Eli felt the air change, less like a refuge and more like a bridge. He and Micah walked toward the corner of the courtyard where the rosemary grew and the dogs lay sleeping. The conversation began as a series of small probes. Did he have enough clothes? Did he want to go home? Did he need money? Each question held a real hunger for solution and an undercurrent of fear. Eli answered with the careful precision of someone mapping out a route. "There's a form," he said finally, taking the envelope from his pocket. "A scholarship. I can go back to school if I get it, but I need to decide whether I want to try or what?" Micah asked. "Or stay here for a while." "Not forever," Eli added quickly, because his voice had a way of making absolutes feel like prisons. "Just until I can stand up straight, until I can show up to school without shaking." Micah sat down on a low stone and ran a hand through his hair. "You don't have to decide now," he said. I'll take the time off. No," Eli interrupted. "I can't make you. I don't want you to." Micah's expression became fierce with a brotherly love that had never learned finesse. "You're not making me anything. I'm your brother. I'm coming whether you like it or not." Eli wanted to argue and then didn't. The stubbornness felt both tender and familiar, an offering of interference and safety. He thought of the man inside, who had given him a towel and a bed, and refused to be thanked like a bank ledger. He thought of the scholarship number and the list of school classes, and the sound of the rats of panic in his chest. "Will you promise me you won't make it a courtroom?" he asked finally. The words were small, precise. Micah nodded, more solemn than the scene required. "I won't. I promise." They sat together on the edge of the garden, two brothers with a history of being insufficiently protective and, despite that, always strangely present. Above them, The sky was the color of thin paper. Somewhere within the house, the man moved about without fuss, as if he belonged to the furniture now. A piece of practical household that mended lives by habit rather than ceremony. Eli felt the shape of the day settle around his shoulders like an unfamiliar coat. It fit awkwardly, but it fit. He had asked for one night and been given more than a room. He had been given the time to discover what he wanted and the safety to consider it. He rose and walked to the door. The man was there, a shadow the way a mountain is a shadow. Silent, present, not asking anything. Eli placed both hands on the old man's forearm, a clumsy, adolescent thing meant to be a touch of gratitude, and found that his fingers fit in a slot of safety. The man did not move. He only met Eli's eyes and held them, a silent agreement being made. "Thank you," Eli said, smaller this time, because words could be simple and enough. The man inclined his head once. "Go slow," he said. "And when you decide, tell me. I will not tell you what to do." Eli stared at him, the sentence a small echo against the wood of the table. The man folded his fingers around his own mug, the knuckles a map of previous seasons. "I will not tell you to stay or go," he finished. "I'll give you what you need to make that choice." It was closer to charity than command. It was, in its way, an agreement to respect the quiet economy of a young life. Micah's arrival stretched into a week that felt like both beginning and test. He came and stayed in the nearby youth hostel, helping Eli sort the few things he'd packed, buying a new toothbrush with a kind of careful ceremoniousness that made the boy laugh for the first time in a brittle while. He and Eli sat up late on a borrowed sofa and did the patient work of being brothers, trading half-answers, making plans that were part begging and part scaffolding. Micah was practical. He called the school, arranged a meeting with a counselor, and promised to help with transportation for the first few weeks. He also argued, in the way siblings do, that Eli should stop hiding details as if they were shame to be saved. Eli resisted, then relented. He told his brother, in fits and starts, about the towel, the garden, the gramophone that played slow things well. Micah listened as if piecing together a map with one hand, while the other held steady on something he didn't yet trust. "It could be worse," Micah said once, the comment more gratitude than comparison. "At least someone's keeping you warm." Eli wanted to say yes and no in the same breath. It had been years since anyone stayed for the reason of staying and not to hold a ledger. He had been taught to expect conditions attached to kindness. Here, there was steadiness and no fine print. The man did what he'd promised. He wrote a short note for the school confirming that Eli had been residing at the estate for the past month and would continue to have a place to return to while he settled matters. It was plain, bureaucratic language and weighty with implication. "It's not a legal guardianship," the man said as he pushed the paper across the kitchen table. "It simply says you have a roof for the moment. It opens doors. You do the walking." Eli folded the note so many times the paper became soft. He felt the shape of things shifting under his hands. The doors that had appeared on paper were only entrances if he chose to put his foot past them. The enrollment meeting was a small ceremonial thing. A woman with a gray bun and a name badge who introduced herself as an intake coordinator, a pile of forms stamped with dates, and a counselor who wore patience like a cardigan. Eli sat with the residue of panic in his throat. The automatic tightening when a voice sounded raised, the reflex to make himself small. But he also carried the man's pen in his pocket, the physical thing that told him someone had offered permission to belong. "Why do you want to come back?" the counselor asked him, gentle and direct. Eli thought of charcoal and fingers, of lines that once trembled and now steadied. "I want to take art," he said. The words surprised him by how true they felt. "And I want to learn to be in a room without waiting for the door to open." The counselor wrote his notes down and looked at him with a consideration that felt like a small hush. "We'll support you," she said. "There are scholarships and after-school programs. It will be slow at first, but you won't be alone." He left the school with a schedule and a list of supplies, and a new kind of vertigo. Possibilities that required steps. The man walked him back to the gate, hands tucked into his coat pockets, the dogs following at a languid, reliable pace. They made no theatrical speeches. They stood on the porch and watched the rain decide on its own whether it wanted to be full earnest or mere mist. "If you need me to come, if there's a difficult conversation, the man said quietly. I will be there. Not to command, but to say I have seen you and I will attend. Eli's throat tightened at the phrase, I will attend. It sounded like a promise that meant being present without judgment. He nodded, small and decisive, the motion of someone practicing a muscle. Thank you. Micah helped him choose a bag for school, sturdy, with enough pockets to keep things organized. They packed the sketchbook and some fresh charcoal, and the brother grinned in a way that had too many things in it. Relief, fear, a worn-out hope. When Eli left for his first day back in class, they stood at the curb until the bus came like two people practicing something new. The bus hum was familiar and strange, like being carried into a world that might not know his most recent wounds. The first day was clumsy and bright. Eli's hands shook when he drew, but they kept going. There was an awkward kindness in classmates asking about the sketchbook, the ordinary curiosity of youth that was not sharp with judgment. His teacher, an older man with an easy laugh, gave him a small nod that felt larger than any lecture. Keep drawing, he said. We learn by putting ourselves on the page. He came home that evening to the low shelter of the house, the kettle whispering, the gramophone leaving its soft scratch in the air. The man had set out 2 small mugs, one for coffee, one for tea, and placed a fresh towel on the dresser, as constant as a bookmark. How was it? The man asked without pressing. Hard, Eli admitted, letting the word rest. And good. Good, the man repeated, like tasting a word and liking it. Some things have to be rusty before they can move again. Eli laughed that quiet laugh he had surprised himself with earlier. He ate, told a few stories about the odd questions people had asked, and then retreated to his room with the sketchbook against his chest. The next morning he woke and drew a hand, his own, tying a lace's knot the way the man had shown him. It was a small ritual that became a thread through his days. Breakfast, the tapping of pencils, chores, classes, evening return. Juxtaposed with those rhythms were the panic flashes that still came, sudden and cruel. A slammed door, a raised voice in a film, a smell that belonged to another home. Each was an irritant that the house could not cure but could temper. Over the weeks, the man's attentions were practical and minimal. He taught Eli to mend a torn sleeve with a needle, to make a basic soup that did not require recipes, to check a fuse so the lights did not go out. He introduced Eli to an older woman who ran the bookshop in town, who lent him volumes on anatomy for artists, and who, after being told a little about the boy's circumstances, wrapped 2 of the books in cloth and sent them home. The man did not hover. He did not make the boy's decisions for him. Instead, he supplied a structure where decisions could be made with less terror. There were tests, small and large. Once, a neighbor who had once scowled at the estate's shadow muttered a question about what sort of company he keeps. The man handled it by offering the neighbor an herb from his garden and a polite phrase, the kind of deflection that was not cowardice, but economy. Another time, Eli received an anonymous note slid under his door with an insult that made his face burn. He wanted to tear the note to shreds in a way that matched the old habit of flight. Instead, he brought it out to the kitchen and placed it on the table in front of the man. Why didn't you throw it away? He asked. Because, the man answered, things that start nothing use energy. Showing them you feel them gives them power. Eli left the note folded small in his pocket and did not respond. Progress, in this house, was measured in increments. 3 consecutive nights without panic. A sketch accepted for a small student show. The acceptance of a teacher as a legitimate part of his life. The scholarship money, small but meaningful, arrived like a practical kindness and anchored the fantasy into reality. Micah took shifts helping with transport and errands, and sometimes he stayed the night in the town hostel. His presence more steady, less frantic. The man, for his part, changed in ways that were subtle but real. He began to speak about plans in a softer tense. He taught Eli how to prune a fig bush so it would bear fruit, and they planted a small row of beans together that summer. In the evenings he would sit and listen to Eli talk about a figure he had drawn, or a technique he wanted to try. Offering a practical suggestion. Try the line with a lighter pressure. And then patting the boy's shoulder, as if acknowledging a small victory. He kept the photograph in the den, but set it on the mantel and left the page open for Eli to glimpse, as if silently permitting him brief access to a memory too heavy to hold close. The clumsy parts of family life reappeared too. One afternoon, Eli's father called the house, voice sharp and clouded by shame and a sense of authority that had been brittle for years. Eli did not answer. He let the call go to voicemail. When he later played it back in the kitchen, Micah held his hand with a quiet insistence. "You don't owe him a performance," Micah said. "You owe him a chance to be better, if he can." Eli considered that, and then deleted the voicemail. He wanted to believe in the possibility of adult change, but he also had learned the necessity of protecting his own small tending of life. He had been taught by too many slammed doors to assume the world would be safe if he simply opened himself up again. There was a moment, about 2 months in, when everything felt like it might tip one way or another. The man received a visitor, one of those silences that the estate's whispers expected. A car at the gate, a brief knot of conversation in the hallway. Eli watched from the landing as the man and the visitor talked in low voices, watched the man's profile sharpen with thought. For hours the house carried an undercurrent of calculation, as if old arrangements had momentarily drifted into view. When the visitor left, the man came upstairs and sat at the foot of Eli's bed. He did not appear to be pleased. He did not appear to be surprised. He simply sat and looked at Eli with the calm of someone who had put one set of arithmetics to rest. "Sometimes, things from the past ask to be noticed," he said. "They do not have to own your present." Eli's reaction was a complicated thing, a mixture of fear and appreciation. He realized then the boundaries that had been quietly established between them. There was no ownership, no claim, only a mutual tending that required consent. A few weeks later, with spring edging the edges of the hedges toward green, the school organized a small gallery walk for the students. Eli's piece, and study of hands tying laces, hung in a modest frame. It was not meant to be the centerpiece of the evening, yet when people walked past his drawing they paused, and then turned to look more thoroughly at the others, as if the clarity of that small scene had set the evening's tone. A teacher patted his shoulder without theatricality. Micah, who had returned from a shift, stood in the back and smiled in a way that made Eli's chest ache with gratitude. The man attended the opening, but did not stand with the crowd. He arrived, leaned against the doorway like someone who had always known his place on the periphery, and watched. When he passed Eli later, he did not make a scene. He slipped a small leather-bound sketchbook into Eli's hand, a gift that caused the boy's breath to hiccup. "I thought you might like a new one," the man said. "Something to start a new line." Eli ran his fingers along the cover and felt something like a boundary finally shift into a road. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying more than politeness. "Keep drawing," the man answered, as if reciting a small benediction. The months settled into a rhythm that was neither miraculous nor ordinary. Eli faltered now and then steadied. He learned to call Micah without pretending to be light when things were heavy. He learned to accept the man's silence as a form of respect, and his presence as a form of safety. The dogs grew older and grayer, and more tolerant of the boy's nervous hands. The beans they planted that first spring climbed the trellis and yielded a modest crop. The house's inward motion was towards small productivity, a washing done well, a meal that did not burn. When summer finally arrived with heavy heat and the bitter scent of sun-warmed stone, Eli sat on the porch steps with his sketchbook across his knees. Micah leaned against the railing, phone in his hand, his brow softer than it had been months before. The man stepped out with 2 steaming mugs and placed one beside them. He stood a while, watching the street like someone who had been taught to read weather. "You've changed," Micah said, blunt and precise, in that way only brothers can be. It was not a question so much as a statement of fact. Eli considered it and then smiled. "I think I have," he admitted. "Do you think you'll go back home?" Micah asked. The question carried all the complexity of the previous seasons. Eli looked at the house, its window frames, its small garden, the place where the gramophone sat, the dog asleep on the step, and then at the road that led back to the town. "I don't think going back means returning to the old map," he said. "It means walking forward with different things in my pocket." Micah nodded like someone tasting truth. "Then we'll make a new map," he said, and his voice softened in a way that carried promise, not command. Eli opened his sketchbook and began to draw without intention. The man's hands, the curve of the porch, the dog's ears, a small boot being tied. The lines came with a steadiness that surprised him. He shaded the space between the figures until it warmed like bread. When he finished, he closed the book and handed it to the man. The gesture was not religious or dramatic. It was simple. "For keeping," he said. The man accepted it as if it were a trivial exchange and then, for the first time in months, allowed his face to arrange into something like a smile. "Keep it," he said. "I'll look after the house. You look after your life." Eli folded his legs up under him and breathed in the summertime light that made everything look possible. "Will you come to my show in 2 months?" he asked, half teasing and half serious. "If there is a show," the man said dryly, "I will be somewhere in the door." It was not a promise of forever. It was a promise of attendance. On the morning he left to start a summer course he had been too terrified to imagine before. Eli packed his bag slowly, as if to make time into something he could carry. Micah drove him to campus. They hugged, awkward and earnest, and the brothers' hands stayed on Eli's shoulders a moment longer than necessary, watching.